Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal as whispers of wrongdoing surrounding Sonny began to spread like wildfire across Port Charles, Laura found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to consume both her political integrity and her personal convictions. Once heralded as the unwavering pillar of moral clarity in a city often plagued by gray lines and quiet corruption, Laura now stood on the precipice of an impossible decision. Her tenure as mayor had been marked by tireless service and devotion to the people, but the growing scrutiny over her perceived loyalty to Sonny placed her in an untenable position. Ezra, lurking in the shadows of political ambition, began to emerge as a formidable adversary. His charm masked a ruthless determination to not only seize the mayor's office but also embed himself deep within the political machinery of Port Charles, shifting its foundational ethos toward control and fear rather than fairness and service. Laura's proximity to Sonny, a man with as many enemies as secrets, became ammunition for Ezra's campaign, and no amount of goodwill could fully shield her from the avalanche of questions swirling around her allegiance. Lulu, torn between admiration for her mother and a fierce desire to see her succeed, pleaded with Laura to sever ties with Sonny publicly and denounce him to preserve her chances in the race against Ezra. But Laura knew that such a move would be more than a political maneuver. It would be a personal betrayal of someone she had known for decades, someone who, despite his flaws, had repeatedly put himself on the line for those he cared about. To speak out against Sonny wouldn't just be a campaign strategy. It would be a moral compromise Laura couldn't stomach. Yet, doing nothing came with its own cost. Every night, as the polls swayed and headlines sharpened, Laura sat alone in her office, wrestling not just with political ramifications, but with the kind of internal reckoning that only years of service and sacrifice could elicit. The price of silence, she feared, was the slow erosion of democracy in a city where hope already felt fragile. But the price of betrayal would be the loss of her soul, the final crack in a foundation that had held strong through war, scandal, and heartbreak. The breaking point came with the quiet but chilling development that WSB investigators had placed Sonny under formal suspicion in connection with the death of Natalia. The evidence was far from definitive. Ambiguous timelines, unreliable witnesses, but it was enough for Ezra and Drew to pounce. With surgical precision, they turned whispers into declarations, launching a coordinated campaign to depict Sonny as a criminal and Laura as his willing accomplice. Media outlets ran with the narrative, amplifying doubts and sowing confusion among voters. The city council, once largely supportive of Laura's leadership, began to fracture as backdoor deals and veiled threats took root. The machine that Ezra had quietly built began to roar to life, and Laura realized she was no longer fighting for re-election, she was fighting to keep Port Charles from sliding into darkness. In a desperate and private meeting held in a nondescript office away from City Hall, Laura was presented with an ultimatum. Ezra, through intermediaries, offered a deal. If she withdrew from the race and relinquished the mayoralty without contest, Sonny would be quietly cleared of all charges. No trial, no press, no lingering suspicions. The case would be sealed and buried, never to resurface. It was blackmail dressed in diplomacy. Laura, weary and heartbroken, saw the trap for what it was, but also the lifeline. She could not allow Sonny to be destroyed by a system rigged against him, especially when the real culprits remained hidden in the shadows. With the weight of her entire legacy pressing down on her shoulders, Laura made the agonizing decision to step aside. Just hours before the final votes were to be cast, she released a carefully worded statement citing personal health reasons and a desire to refocus on her family. The public never knew the true cost of those words. Ezra, now unopposed, declared victory with theatrical modesty and wasted no time in reshaping the city in his image. Drew became his silent partner, orchestrating administrative overhauls and quietly placing loyalists in key positions throughout the court system and law enforcement. Sidwell, always the opportunist, stepped forward as the public face of reform, championing transparency while manipulating legislation from behind the curtain. The triumvirate tightened its grip on Port Charles, gradually transforming the city from a place of principled resistance to a stronghold of calculated fear. Political rivals were discredited or disappeared from the public eye entirely, replaced by figures more amenable to Ezra's vision. Funding was redirected, investigative units were disbanded, and whistleblowers found themselves at the mercy of suddenly restructured HR policies or vague ethics violations. To the average citizen, the changes appeared subtle at first: longer waits for social services, closed-door meetings, fewer community forums. But beneath the surface, a chilling silence settled over Port Charles. The press became tamer, civic organizations more compliant, and the city's proud tradition of vocal activism was replaced with whispers and careful glances. All the while, Laura, now a private citizen, watched with quiet anguish as the city she had poured her life into fell under the control of men who twisted every thread of democracy into a net of subjugation. Her sacrifice had spared Sonny, but the cost had been far greater than she anticipated. Yet Laura was not defeated. In the background, she began reaching out, carefully, quietly, to those she could still trust. Anna, Valentine, and even a few disillusioned members of the WSB lent their support to her growing underground network. The goal was no longer political restoration, it was moral salvation. Laura understood that Ezra's regime would not fall overnight. The corruption ran deep, the lies were well constructed, and the fear was palpable. But she also knew that Port Charles had weathered storms before. The people, when awakened, were capable of rising. And so she worked, not with speeches or press conferences, but with whispers and coded messages, gathering names, collecting evidence, building alliances. Tracy, once skeptical of Laura's withdrawal, began to sense the larger play unfolding. In a dramatic city council session, she called out inconsistencies in Ezra's financial disclosures and challenged the legitimacy of several zoning decisions tied to Drew's real estate interests. The room grew tense. Cameras rolled. The first crack in Ezra's facade had appeared. Drew, normally measured, began to lose control behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Sonny, freed from the legal noose around his neck, started asking dangerous questions of his own. Why had Laura really stepped down? Who had benefited most from Natalia's death? And what did Ezra stand to gain from his sudden rise? The answers, buried beneath layers of deception, would not stay hidden forever. As Laura stood at the edge of this new resistance, no longer a mayor but something perhaps even more powerful, a symbol of quiet defiance, she realized her true fight was only beginning. Her legacy would not be defined by the office she left behind, but by the light she carried forward in the face of encroaching darkness. And Port Charles, though wounded and weary, still had hope, for as long as Laura breathed, the soul of the city had not been lost. Meanwhile, Laura descended into a deep state of reflective sorrow, not regret, but profound mourning for everything she had relinquished. The cost of her decision had never been just the mayoral seat, it was the erosion of trust from those who had stood beside her through decades of triumphs and tribulations. Her withdrawal from the election may have spared Sonny from a public crucifixion, but it fractured the confidence of her most steadfast allies. Lulu, her daughter and longtime confidant, viewed the move as a betrayal of their shared values. It wasn't just political strategy that Lulu questioned, it was moral integrity. In her eyes, Laura had compromised the very ideals she had raised her to believe in. Tracy, sharp and skeptical as ever, grew increasingly guarded, unsure whether Laura had been outmaneuvered or had willingly capitulated to forces darker than anyone had anticipated. But it was Sonny's reaction that haunted Laura most. He said nothing. His silence wasn't laced with anger or gratitude, it was hollow, impenetrable, and eerily detached. Though he was now a free man, absolved of public scrutiny and legal consequence, even Sonny could not deny that his freedom had come at the price of a woman's dignity, one who had chosen loyalty over ambition and compassion over survival. And yet, Laura's withdrawal from power did not extinguish her influence. She began to understand that she was never simply a politician or a figurehead, she had always been something greater, a unifier, a moral compass, the quiet strength around which people with fractured faith could reassemble. From the shadows she had once fought to avoid, Laura now chose to operate. No longer confined by political red tape or public expectation, she began to build something far more radical and quietly revolutionary. A resistance grounded not in vengeance, but in the pursuit of ethical restoration. With the discreet aid of trusted allies like Anna, whose experience in law enforcement lent credibility and strategy, and Jordan, whose sense of justice had been long tested but never extinguished, Laura began mapping out the first threads of a covert alliance. Even Valentine, once an unlikely participant in any cause other than his own, appeared at her side. Not for redemption, but perhaps for once, to stand on the right side of a crumbling system. Together, they envisioned a new mission, not to reclaim an office, but to restore the soul of a city consumed by unchecked ambition and authoritarian rot. At the same time, the cracks in Ezra's so-called administration of renewal began to deepen. Initially lauded by the press as a reformist leader, Ezra had swiftly used his newfound power to enact a series of policy changes and executive decisions that masked systemic corruption with the veneer of progress. Shady investment deals were pushed through with alarming speed, often funneled into shell corporations with no physical offices and vague business models. The city budget, once balanced with transparency and scrutiny, began bleeding funds through backdoor reallocations and newly invented emergency appropriations. Public records vanished, whistleblower protections were gutted, and independent watchdog groups reported sudden shutdowns without explanation. What once seemed like political maneuvering gradually revealed itself to be something far more sinister, an intentional dismantling of accountability. Laura, though removed from office, watched with growing horror as the mechanisms of democracy she once safeguarded were dismantled, brick by brick, under the guise of civic advancement. But it wasn't just Laura who noticed. Tracy, who had remained largely silent in the immediate aftermath of Ezra's rise, suddenly emerged as a force of dissent. In a public council meeting broadcast citywide, she leveled sharp, incisive questions at Ezra, demanding full transparency regarding the city's budget overruns and foreign real estate acquisitions linked to his office. Her words cut through the chamber with surgical precision, and the room, packed with spectators and press, went dead silent. It was the first open challenge Ezra had faced since his inauguration, and the first moment many citizens began to question whether their new leader was truly acting in their interest, or merely manipulating the system for personal gain. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, Drew, once the mastermind behind many of Ezra's strategic moves, began to buckle under the mounting pressure. His confidence, once bolstered by power and precision, started to waver as key figures in his orbit began pulling away. Sam, once fiercely loyal, grew distant, suspicious of Drew's increasing secrecy and moral compromises. Michael, always sensitive to corruption within his family's sphere of influence, quietly began re-evaluating his alliance. The optics of the administration began to change. Once seen as visionary reformers, Drew and Ezra now appeared secretive, manipulative, and dangerously unaccountable. And then there was Sidwell, the kingmaker behind the curtain, who had assumed that his partnership with Ezra would cement his influence for years to come. But Laura's unexpected resurgence in the hearts and minds of the people unsettled him. Despite his attempts to erase her from public memory through manufactured scandals and whispered narratives, Laura's legacy refused to fade. Her name was still spoken in quiet reverence at town halls, in community centers, and among those who had once served under her leadership. What Sidwell failed to grasp was that Laura had never relied solely on office or title, her power had always come from the trust she inspired. And now, that trust was becoming contagious once again. Port Charles, long a city suspended between chaos and community, found itself standing at a precipice. The battle lines were being drawn not through protests or marches, but through subtle shifts in allegiance, hushed conversations in back rooms, and the reawakening of conscience in those who had once turned away. Laura had sacrificed her crown, but in doing so, had become something far more dangerous to the new regime, an unbreakable ideal. And ideals, unlike political terms, do not expire. They linger, they grow, and when nurtured by courage and truth, they rise again. In a stunning and seismic turn of events, new evidence surrounding the mysterious death of Natalia began to surface, evidence that shattered the official narrative and unveiled a much darker, orchestrated deception. Initially dismissed as circumstantial whispers, the fragments of proof grew into a damning trail of manipulation, pointing not to a random act of violence or a desperate accident, but to a meticulously constructed political trap. One that had been designed from its inception to ensnare Sonny, crush Laura's administration, and pave the way for Ezra's rise to unchecked power. Surveillance footage was recovered that had previously been erased from city archives. Witness statements, long buried under bureaucratic obstruction, re-emerged with startling clarity. Forensic inconsistencies in the original autopsy report, once brushed aside, were now impossible to ignore. Piece by piece, the puzzle reassembled into something undeniable. Natalia's death had not been merely convenient for Ezra, it had been engineered by forces under his influence, executed with the singular aim of creating a scandal so devastating that Laura would have no political recourse but to resign. The revelation tore through Laura with a grief deeper than any she had endured in her years of public service. She had believed in the possibility of redemption for Ezra once. Believed that beneath his ambition, there lay a thread of humanity worth preserving. She had hoped that, even as rivals, there could be boundaries neither of them would cross. But the truth, brutal, cold, and unrelenting, was now clear. Ezra had not only crossed those boundaries, he had erased them entirely. He had weaponized her loyalty, exploited her sacrifice, and desecrated every ideal she had spent a lifetime defending. And yet, even as the pain threatened to consume her, Laura did not crumble. She did what she had always done in the face of injustice, she stood up. But this time, she did not return as the mayor, wrapped in titles or political obligations. She emerged from the shadows not as an official, but as something far more dangerous to a regime built on lies. A mother determined to protect her daughter's future, a friend seeking justice for a man nearly destroyed, and a leader guided not by ambition but by the sacred responsibility to truth. Laura no longer needed a campaign slogan or a staff of advisors. She had something infinitely more powerful, moral clarity, righteous anger, and the backing of a city that was beginning to see through the illusion Ezra had created. The battle ahead would not be fought in ballot boxes or televised debates. This was a war of secrets, of whispered alliances and hidden records. It was a resistance forged in quiet resolve and careful strategy, and Laura was no stranger to navigating darkness. With Anna by her side, now reinvigorated by the truth, and Jordan working to reopen cold files that had been unlawfully sealed, Laura set her sights on dismantling the machine from the inside. Valentine operated in the international shadows, using his connections to follow the money trail that linked Ezra's campaign to offshore accounts and undisclosed shell corporations tied to Natalia's final hours. Together, they uncovered layers of corruption so intricately woven, it became clear that Ezra had never worked alone. The conspiracy stretched beyond Port Charles, involving WSB defectors, political financiers, and private security firms masquerading as city contractors. As Laura pushed deeper, the stakes escalated. Journalists who dared to report on the new findings were threatened. Civic organizations supportive of Laura's cause found their funding abruptly slashed. Informants went silent, and surveillance of her allies increased. But the more the opposition tried to silence her, the more the public began to question why they were so desperate to do so. Slowly, the city began to awaken. Former skeptics turned into cautious supporters. New whistleblowers came forward with encrypted files, voice recordings, and documentation that further exposed the artificial foundation of Ezra's empire. Rumors began to circulate, not just of Natalia's murder, but of blackmail campaigns, falsified voting records, and secret meetings at luxury estates under armed guard. Through it all, Laura never once positioned herself as a returning savior. She didn't need to. Her power no longer came from the mayor's office. It radiated from the unwavering moral compass that guided her every step. In every alleyway she walked, in every hushed meeting she arranged, and in every piece of truth she brought into the light, Laura ignited something that Ezra and his cohorts had long believed they had extinguished: hope. A belief that Port Charles could be more than a playground for the powerful. That justice could rise even after being buried under layers of lies. And as the machinery of Ezra's control began to sputter and tremble under the weight of its exposed sins, the people of Port Charles began to remember who Laura really was. Not just a mayor. Not just a mother. But the conscience of a city, silent for too long, now roaring back to life. The skyline no longer bore her name in campaign signs, but in the graffiti that spread across alley walls, she still watches. She still fights. Her influence had transcended office. It had become legend. Ezra, for all his calculated moves, could not predict what happens when truth becomes contagious. When fear turns into fury. And when one woman, stripped of power but armed with purpose, chooses to rise, not for herself, but for every soul who had been betrayed. Laura's flame, once flickering under the suffocating weight of political gamesmanship, now burned brighter than ever. And in that fire, Port Charles found its second chance. Not from the halls of City Hall, but from the quiet, unrelenting march of justice reclaiming its place in a city that had nearly forgotten what it looked like.